Hello, and welcome to the Mobile User Acquisition Show, a podcast to help you unlock tremendous growth for your app. My name is Shamant Rao. I'm the CEO of the boutique growth marketing firm Rocketship HQ and host of the podcast Mobile User Acquisition Show. In each episode, we feature experts in the field of mobile growth and discuss strategies, tips, and pointers from the leading edge of mobile growth marketing. By the end of each episode, you will have gained actionable and tactical insights that will help you make more informed decisions in your own work around growth. The Mobile User Acquisition Show is produced by Meryl Vincent, Content Marketing Manager at Rocketship HQ. Our guest today is Simon Vishnevskiy, the Head of Paid Acquisition at Dave. In today's episode, Simon shares the fascinating story of how he built the mobile marketing function from scratch in his current role. He talks about the absolute necessities to keep in mind while getting started, from reporting to building the team to getting the best possible infrastructure. Simon also talks about his approach to UA post-ATT and describes how his team has dealt with the broken measurement on iOS. Simon also shares his 2 cents on the pros and cons of hiring full-timers versus agencies versus contractors at different stages of growth. Finally, Simon ends today's episode with his take on incrementality and how it is such a big deal. We hope today's episode offers inspiration and guidance to you in your own growth journey. I'm very excited to welcome Simon Vishnevskiy to the Mobile User Acquisition Show. Simon, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Simon, I'm so excited to have you. Again, we've known each other since a very long time, many, many years. And you've done big things, great things since then, which we will talk about. And what struck me as very impressive, particularly, is that you went into your current role and built a mobile marketing function from scratch with not a lot of precedent, with not a lot of a blueprint around. And I found that very inspiring and impressive. And certainly your current company just IPO'd very recently too. So that the proof of your work is in the pudding, so to speak. Right, so I'm excited to dive into all of that in your experience, Simon. So thrilled to welcome you here again.
Right. Yeah, thank you so much. Glad to share. And this should be fun and interesting.
Absolutely. So I would start at the beginning. So you joined your current role at Dave. And like I said earlier, you did set up an entire mobile marketing function. Mm-hmm. Now, let's just say somebody is in a similar position that they're starting in a new company and they're like, there isn't a lot around in the new company. How do they decide if they should even set up a mobile marketing function or whether the product is just so broken that they should just quit and go home?
So I think probably as a lot of people that will listen to this understand and know that you have to prove your product first, right? You have to get some organic traction. You have to understand your key metrics. And what you need to know is you really need to understand whether or not the product is viable and you can even have any kind of monetization on your product from your first organic cohort. So setting up certain tests, setting up certain KPIs and figuring out whether or not you can drive towards those KPIs is your main question number one, right? Like, can we really get an MVP going and understand whether the product is viable? But if you get certain indicators, if you see in your user base move in certain direction, if you're able to monetize off of your early cohorts of users, because those are some of the very receptive people, those are early adopters. If you're seeing this, then of course the next logical question is, can we actually start increasing our user base and start investing in some of our UA functions? And this is kind of the point at which you have to make the decision. But my first thought would be, are we seeing enough organic traction? Are we seeing enough organic growth? And are we seeing really good metrics from our users, such as retention, such as monetization, even early on in the product's life cycle? So that's extremely important.
Yeah. So beyond just product market fit, there has to be some quantifiable metrics, like you said, retention, monetization. Tell us a bit more about when you started in your current role at Dave. Can you set the lay of the land a bit and tell us a bit more about what the infrastructure was like, what the team was like when you started?
Definitely. I mean, I think some of the things that I've inherited was definitely very junior UA buyers. So this is really a reality of startup world. You often have a lot of marketing spend, and you don't necessarily have the resources to compete with the big companies. So you end up having very junior media buyers that are in charge oftentimes of massive budgets. So as a head of UA, when you come in a situation like that, you definitely have to have your assessment and understand whether you need additional hiring, whether you need additional training, like what is that you need in order to have your media buyers being more efficient. Maybe you bring in an agency, and that's something we're probably going to talk later on in some of our discussion points. And so I think that's one thing for sure, is assessing your personnel. So I inherited very junior media buyers. I've also inherited a very, very massive reporting structure, which is something that I think a lot of people also get when they start somewhere, especially if you come from a big corporate company, if you're coming from somewhere where marketing team is north of like 40 and you have a person for every single use case, you have someone there that can fix it for you, right? You have your MarTech people, data analysts, you have your experienced media buyers, and you go to a startup and all of a sudden you see that reports are being run on Tableau and they're a bit obsolete and they're not really useful for your use case. They're not really getting things to the place where they need to be. That's really problematic, and that's something I've inherited. And I think one of the probably most important things along the sides of reporting is really grabbing the right MMP. And that's something that I've inherited that I was happy about. We were working with AppsFlyer, and that was the MMP of choice, which we're still working with. And so that piece was in a good place, but that's also something that you really, really need to consider when you're starting first. Like, what is that you're inheriting? Do you have good attribution? Because without it, nothing works. Do you have good reporting? Because without it, nothing really works. How strong is your team? And so I've inherited a mix of good and the bad. And so the infrastructure was in okay shape, but my team needed a lot of training.
Yeah, so you had junior media buyers, some not great dashboards, but you had an MMP that was strong. And then I would also say some people who start off at startups inherit no infrastructure. So that can be a different set of problems altogether. But certainly I think hitting the reset button on infrastructure that isn't working is a huge challenge. I hear you. And we'll talk about that certainly. So that's what you inherit. So as you get started, your first couple of weeks and months, what were some of the things you focused on? What were some of the things you didn't focus on? So what was the highest ROI things in the very beginning, and what are the lowest ROI things?
Yeah, I think, that's definitely a case of 80-20. Like, I think I really like 80-20 concept, right? And apply it to a lot of different situations. And really, there's almost always two things about the highest ROI when you start. It's where the money is. So like, how we're optimizing, where are we spending the money? Where are the gaps? Like, is this something that's channel specific? So day-to-day operations, right? Like, where is the biggest bang for the buck? Second is infrastructure and support. Where is that other bucket that will help you spend your marketing budgets more efficiently / scale, right? So you're looking at the current situation, but you're also looking at infrastructure that can push you towards the future. So for us, there are a couple of things. First thing on the infrastructure side was definitely reporting, right? Without good reporting, without understanding how your money is working for you and where you get your results by channel, by portfolio, what are you looking at in terms of your performance? You cannot really optimize and you cannot really spend efficiently. But then on the portfolio level as well, you really need to understand what is your channel performance? How are you tracking it? What are some of the day-to-day optimizations that you do? So I think those are kind of a couple of my key pillars. And the last pillar that I think we haven't touched upon yet, but that's really, really key to any good user acquisition program is creative. How is your creative optimization? How is your creative reporting? And what is being done there? So what I had to do is I had to build a lot of infrastructure for all of these. On the creative optimization front, I had to pull a person from my team to build reports, and I had to work with one of our external partners to actually have a creative optimization tool and implement it in-house. On the reporting side, I was able to secure some resources, not necessarily ideal, but in a limited scope that we had, a limited capacity, and start fixing that infrastructure. And then day-to-day stuff is where what I did was a different thing that I think would be interesting for some of our listeners and viewers, because this is actually not a typical solution. So what I did is I brought some of the outside help and I set up a mentorship program for my UA buyers. So I brought someone for 1 hour a week for our key channel where we spend the most of their money, just like everyone else, which is probably, as you'll know, would be Facebook, Google, and channels such as that and Apple search. And I brought the outside help to help mentor and tutor people for a certain number of hours a week. And that actually helped us make a lot of progress. So those were kind of the key pillars where I focused immediately on.
You're right in that, just the data infrastructure piece, because it's so critical and it oftentimes gets overlooked just because it also happens to be resource intensive to set up dashboards, right? And especially at early stage companies, it can get overlooked, but really you need to understand where your money is going. And that it's so easy to overlook that. Which brings me to my next question, right? So with building dashboards, with ensuring there's data integrity, you could say there is a case for just using MMP dashboards, getting Excel reports from that, use that for day-to-day decision making. That is one set of possibilities for a company, for a team. So how do you decide whether a company should build a somewhat customized dashboard, be it in Tableau, be it in an internal database, or they could use third-party tools to visualize any of this? So how do you go about deciding whether to just use MMP plus Excel or something more customized? And does that actually change by the scale at which the company is?
It's an interesting question, right? And I don't think there's really a one solution that fits all, but I can speak from my point of view. And I think as someone who has quite a bit of an experience doing this from a startup companies to companies of a higher scale, I have an interesting perspective on that. And my perspective is really, you want to do your best right from the get-go. I've consulted companies that are at a pretty critical stage in their growth, and they've secured round B financing, round C, very big companies with very substantial market valuation, that they're still running legacy, not legacy, but really like tier 2 MMP and tier 2 reporting, right? And their answer as to why is that they never really had resources, they grew too fast, and now they're faced with the problem of not being able to grow their business, especially on the marketing side, because they have a second tier tools and second tier partnerships that they're experiencing, right? And to a degree where even someone like who is maybe of my caliber, someone even who's higher caliber than me, a VP of growth or a CMO or a really serious person that's being interviewed for this role, might not even agree to join a company because they're using very obsolete tools. And he understands that this is really, really hard to come in and straighten it out in a period of time. So my answer to using the best MMP right from the get-go, and as you know, it's tiered, so you have your Adjust and AppsFlyer, which is probably two dominant players in the market now, and then below that you have things like Tune, you have things like Branch, you have a few others, right? So you want to get to that A level right from the get-go if you have the resources, because this is what's going to drive your business: data integrity, and then understanding your true performance. And then in terms of reporting, right, and to your particular question of why can't we just use MMP and Excel? Well, there are reasons for that. Is it because you want to build a sophisticated reporting, and sophisticated reporting feeds into a lot of different use cases, anything from building LTV projections, which is probably North Star for a lot of companies, right? Not just understanding what are you getting out of your budget, but what is that you expect to get out of your budget in a year, in a period of year, 2 years, 3 years, right? My gaming experience, be it in Zynga, this is exactly how we ran the user acquisition, as you remember. And so having that robust reporting right from the get-go and having the right MMP is what I would recommend. Now, with that being said, of course, there's different stages. Those top level, top tier MMPs, they charge a substantial amount. So maybe you cannot afford it at your round A or a seed level money. So you got to start somewhere reasonable. But my answer to why why one should do it as early as possible, because this really, really hinders your ability to scale. So if you're looking at your revenue to cost equation on those tools, yes, maybe right now having 5% of your costs going towards your MMP is a lot, right, of your overall cost.
Yeah.
But if you scale your marketing spend by 5x, all of a sudden that becomes only 1% of your cost, right? And without that MMP, you cannot get to the scale where a lot of that gets efficient. So this is an efficiency that buys you more efficiency, right? So this is a good investment that buys you more efficiency. So that's kind of my answer there. Do it as soon as possible, get tier 1 tools, and then build the best robust reporting as fast as you can and as early as you can in the company's life cycle.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing you say is really, even if you're a startup with relatively low spend, oftentimes you shouldn't just build for your current level of scale. You should just build for your future level of scale, because you're not going to scale otherwise.
That's exactly right. And similar concept applies to people acquiring to their current LTV, right? So my previous job was at Lyft. And so as an example, right, you're looking at the LTV curves of those type of companies, Lyft and Uber, right? And you see what 1 year revenue per user does. Early in the life cycle, it's very little, right? And then as the markets mature, as the service matures, and even look at Uber, right? They added Uber Eats, they added additional services. Now their LTV is 3-4x of what it was 4 years ago. So if you were acquiring to that LTV at the time, you will leave in a huge market share at the table. So you always should have some assumption about your growth. Now, they could be extremely aggressive, which I don't recommend, or they can be somewhat rooted in the reality. And this is why you need to have the MMP and reporting in a similar fashion. You need to assume certain growth. Yeah,
and certainly I've seen products with very, very significant downstream LTVs, but they're like, oh, we need to just acquire to D60, D90 payback. And we're like, you're not going to be able to spend anything or scale anything if you do D60 or D90, if all of your revenue is happening way beyond, right? So I think that makes so much sense. Simon, I know one of the things you said was about the dashboards was really, you built a lot of custom dashboards, including, I believe you said, understanding which creatives are driving performance. Obviously, a lot of the dashboards and the world of data and analysis has changed massively since last April, since ATT. Primarily, conversion value tracking is broken because of scan. There's privacy thresholds, which obfuscate a lot of things. There's just no creative level reporting that's somewhat reliable. So how have you thought about approaching your data dashboard building or modifying those dashboards in the light of ATT, given the completely broken information ecosystem, if you will?
I think it's an extremely relevant question, especially in 2022, as we've seen the ATT, and we're also seeing Google probably moving towards restricting the ability to track on the device as well. That's coming 2022, 2023. We can only guess the time, but it's coming based on the directions that the wind blows, so to speak. And so that event is definitely, especially for iOS, that was supposed to be a grave digger. And so that was a lot of confusion, and that was definitely a lot of panic. But I think if you were game planning and you were reasonable about some of the things that you knew you could do, you could definitely come up with a game plan. So there are a couple of things to my game plan. First, and this is really important too, and this is in addition to infra and reporting, my game plan was adding a MarTech manager. And so, if we're going to have a pretty good audience here and people listening, and especially if they have the resources, they're now at like round B, round C companies, or even publicly traded companies. Publicly traded companies tend to have MarTech managers, especially if they're on marketing budgets. But a lot of companies at kind of this mid stage, they don't. And the value of MarTech manager is extremely important, because these are the people that set up scan networks for you, which helps us track in the absence of any other attribution in ATT. And for us personally, we've pivoted out from not being able to track to being able to run our user acquisition campaigns fairly efficient, because we've been able to reproduce the scan networks and set it up and work with AppsFlyer. And that's really important piece of tracking for us, So this has been a kind of a changing event from where we went from the place of not having any data to have enough data to be efficient on iOS and being able to acquire to iOS. So that's one thing. I recommend doing this. I recommend getting a MarTech manager, A. B, I recommend setting up scan network and working with your MMP, because this is extremely important. That is really the best proxy. Setting up scan is the best proxy to how things were in the past, to do it in the present. So it's very, 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 very close to how things were in the past. Second thing is really internal attribution. So I think in terms of dashboarding, and this is really directly answering your question, how do you build dashboards that pretty much give you the same access to data that they used to be before ATT? Like is it really even possible? It's not really 100% possible, but you can replicate 90% of that. So one of the techniques and strategies is to do something that's called reattribution. And I can talk about it in a little more detail because this is interesting. So if you have a product with stable conversion rates that track over time, you always need to have something that you can refer to as a baseline. So let's assume our baseline happened before ATT. And so we have steady conversion rates. And now our conversion rates have declined because we're just not able to attribute users to certain channels, such as Facebook, Google, Apple search, paid channels, right? So if you're running paid attribution, what you need to do is you need to look at your baseline before all the changes and apply similar conversion rates to the post-ATT environment, right? It's a fairly simple concept, but it does work. So we've done this across all our really like iOS acquisition, and we've been able to reattribute users and have been able to establish new baseline that is somewhat similar and accurate versus how things were in the past, as opposed to missing all those signals and not having them on our backend because of obviously the restrictions that iOS is putting on them. So that's very important to do this work internally because your MMP is missing all those signals and missing all this data. Unfortunately, MMP cannot do much. The only thing MMP can do for you is help you set scan network and being able to attribute at least some of those signals, right? So there's multiple layers working here. Your internal reattribution that you need to set up, and you need to bring your data science people or data people to help you there. It's not a very sophisticated concept. It's really a simple concept. Establish a baseline, and then based off that historical baseline, you reattribute some of your activation, installs, whatever the key metrics are, to your paid campaigns now in the present moment. Set up a scan network and do all the work on the scan side to be able to ingest some of the signals. And then also on the advertiser side, make sure that all the signals that you have are being properly mapped. So then channels such as Facebook, Google, Snap, and TikTok, and whatever you're working with are able to optimize off of the correct events and being able to optimize towards the events that is still being tracked, because otherwise you're going to lose a lot of performance. So it's really multi-layer approach, but I think I've covered some of the key pillars, and that should be really helpful for people that are starting from scratch and don't necessarily have an idea how to combat this.
That's very interesting, man. If what I understand you're saying is right, you're saying, look, if you know your Facebook conversion rate is 25% better than Google, that's 25% better than Snap, and you have the install counts, you basically use your scan data to get an estimate of how much activations you got, how many transactions you got from Facebook, because you know it's 25% better than Google, that's 25% better than Snap. That's very interesting, yeah. And certainly I can see how having a MarTech manager who can do that sort of analysis, who can use that to build the dashboards to really make clear that, yes, this is an estimate, but this is a well-founded estimate. I think that becomes so critical, right?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. Because again, the best we can do is estimate, but this is an estimate based in your historical data. And so, you got to apply that in an absence of better indicators, and try to make sure that the data going forward is still being passed through scan network, and you have some nuggets of data that are there that you can make decisions and optimizations based off of. Exactly.
I know you briefly touched on hiring, and you briefly touched on the team that you inherited, and obviously you've hired folks since then. Your team has grown since then. What are some of the milestones at which you decided to hire new folks? Is it like linked to X amount of spend, X amount of active users? How do you sort of say, okay, this is the time to hire more?
Couple of things that you need to do if you're heading operations for any company, really. You need to look at your current scale, and you need to look at your potential scale. And what that really means is just how many more resources do I need in order to get me to a different level, or am I efficient at my certain level? Like how much more can I squeeze out of it? So that's one, just like really budget considerations alone, right? Like, what is my goal here? Where is my current spend levels? And does my team actually have the expertise at the current level to do the work? And then does my team have the expertise to do the work and push us to the higher level, right? So you need to do this assessment. And I think one of the things is you need to understand opportunities for scaling and where those opportunities come from. Again, it's another 80-20 question, right? So what I've seen companies do, and I think you can attest to that because we work together at Zynga and we've run the portfolio of games, across different channels. A lot of time, companies focus on building the long tail of channels. For example, you bring in a person and they onboard 7, 8 different channels. But in aggregate, a spend on those 8 channels end up being 10% of what you're doing on Facebook. So bringing a person on Facebook who's more experienced and optimizing that X amount of budget will give you higher yields than bringing someone else and onboarding 20 different channels. So that's something to keep in mind. Like, where are your opportunities for growth? Where is your current spend? And how does the person in that role support excellent optimizations, excellent strategy, anything that really, really drives the company forward and drives your portfolio forward? And so that's kind of my thought, first of all, with UA media buyers, right? Like, is this person good enough for my current level of spend on this particular channel, or can they take us to a different level if they come in with experience, with strategy, what have they done in the past type of a situation? Second, infrastructure, right? Like I've mentioned MarTech manager. It's a very, very key hire for me. I can share with you that if I did not hire my MarTech manager in my current role, Dave, at the right time, the results for us, especially in light of the ATT, would have been completely different. We wouldn't be able to scale as much as we've done. We wouldn't be able to be in those App Annie, Sensor Tower charts where we are right now, because we wouldn't be able to spend. We'd have no signals, we'd have no way of doing this. Similarly with reporting. If our reporting wasn't as robust as it is right now, looking at things as ROAS, day 7 return, and some other downstream KPI funnel metrics, we wouldn't be able to spend as efficiently as we are now. So that's the thing. You need to hire for your infra. And on the day-to-day side, you want to make sure that your ambitions or your current state is really backed up by a person that have necessary skills to either maintain or grow the business. I hire with a growth mindset. I don't hire with maintain mindset. If I'm thinking that we can 3x, I want to know, what does this person understand in terms of strategy and execution? Like, what have they done in the past? What are some of the best methodology and best practices that they know that will push us there?
Yeah, and I can already see the patterns, right? And how you think, right? So you're like, look, when we're building dashboards, we're not building for the current level of spend. We're building for the future level of spend. It sounds like even with the team, we're like, look, we're not hiring for where we are now. We want to hire for where we will be a few months, a few years down the line. And I think it certainly makes sense. And speaking of hiring, what were the first roles you hired for and why?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things that were interesting areas. Specifically, one area where I think a lot of companies, honestly speaking, do not invest and a lot of times are not even aware, because as we mentioned, there's a proliferation of startups now. A lot of companies get well funded. As you know, like 2021 has been a hot year for startups. So a lot of people come in growth and even growth leadership positions, and they simply don't have enough experience. They're not well-rounded and they don't understand like what are the areas that can make sense, the whole 80-20 conversation, right? So for me, one of the areas was getting a person to do ASO. I think it's really, really important to do App Store optimization the right way. So when you look at the company that gained a bit of traction, right, and look at how many people land on the front page and in their App Store, whether it's App Store or Google Play, this is where the journey starts. This is where all the user journey starts. If you have a mobile app, this is exactly where the user lands, whether they come in organically or they've seen your ads and they click, right? That's such an important part of the journey. And so not optimizing that part of the journey is really, really a head scratcher for me. So that was one of my first steps, like bring that person on board, right?
Yeah. I can jump in. When you say do it the right way, there's just a lot of ASO experts around. What's doing it the right way versus somebody who just doesn't know?
Doing it the right way is having a strategy. And that strategy is testing. That strategy is having the tools to back up the testing, right? Actually, matter of fact, I'm working with a colleague of ours, Sarah, that we used to work at Zynga, and they brought her on board. And I think she's one of the great people in this space because she's very educational and she has tons of experience. But a lot of the work revolves around testing, getting the data, getting the numbers, backing up your thoughts and ideas and assumptions with an actual data. And that's really like where one should be. Competitive analysis, understanding what are people in this space doing. So it's not just coming in and making things look pretty. It's actually coming in with an idea of how can we do something in multiple steps that benefit the business, how we can prove that value, and like what are the tools that we need to bring, and what are some of the partnerships that we need to bring. And so I agree, lots of people in this space, right? Some people might not be as good, some people fake it, we don't know. Like, I mean, it's a big space, there's a lot of ASO experts. But if you bring one person on board, one way I would evaluate them immediately is, what is their game plan? It's not like, hey, like we're going to do this one thing. No, but what's the end result? Because you need to be on a certain type of cadence. As you know, it's just like with a UA manager or like a really experienced UA manager. They won't tell you like, listen, I will just adjust the campaign budget on Facebook. No, they will have a game plan. They will say, oh, I want to build creative. I want to build creative process. I want to build a process around geo expansion. I want to build process around event optimization, right? There's like multiple different layers within best practices and methods that an experienced person would have. And ASO is similar. Like they need to think 3-4 steps ahead of 5, and they need to have an ultimate goal in mind, which is how do we drive conversion rate? What do we do in order to get more people to actually install our app and engage with our business?
Sure. No, that makes complete sense. And really, when I say ASO experts, I think there are a lot of people that are somewhat hacky in nature. And you're right. And just calling out exactly what you're looking for. Also, because I think ASO is one of those things that can come across as not as precisely measurable as user acquisition, which sounds like you're really looking for rigor and thinking about what the end outcomes should be. And still staying on the topic of hiring, Simon, how did you think about, I know you talked about your first couple of hires and how your team has grown. How did you think about hiring agencies versus contractors versus full-time folks? And which of those is the right decision at different stages of your growth?
It's an interesting case because we're a startup where I started and we were around B, and now we're a publicly traded company in the span of slightly less than 2 years. And we've done it as a lean and very mean machine, right, so to speak. So I think there's different ways of doing it, right? Like no one size fits all. But with that being said, I think what you need to do is really come with it with open mind. I know some folks that say, I want to build the team in-house and in-house only. And that's all I've ever done. And that's all I'm ever going to do. Like, that's the best way to have your expertise. I know people that say we have no time. I only like agencies because I don't need to train anyone. It's such a headache to bring people on board and interviewing people. Interviewing an agency is, interviewing one person and then making sure that the support level is there, right? Like it's a lot easier than trying to interview 7 people for a period of like 6 months. So there's different lines of thinking. So for me, I think one thing for sure is it's easier to fill certain niche roles with contractors, and it's faster because they move fast. You don't really need to have an approval of the entire team, for example, right? As opposed to like hiring a full-time, So contractors is really a nice band-aid, but also even with contractors, the way I think about it is long-term. If you're hiring a contractor, can you potentially convert this person full-time? If you can convert them, could they still stay with you for half a year? I don't want to hire a person for a month. It's just really not the best investment. So even with contractors, think about what they can do for you long-term and whether or not this is a person you want to be working for, like, let's say a period of a year. That's first. But contractors are the easiest solution. Then I think full-time folks. My thinking for that is also different from a lot of people in the industry. When I hire full-time folks, my main question is, can they be my right hand? Whatever it is, the role that I'm hiring for, I want to understand whether those people have potential to be my right hand. And they might be junior. It might take a year or a year and a half or 2 years working with me. But eventually, can I say, person X, John, let's call him John. Can I say, John, all right, I want you to take over while I'm gone on vacation for 2 weeks. Can you actually do exec reports? Can you do the functions that I do? Can you be my right hand? And so, I like to see professional growth, and I think people are motivated by that. So my full-timers are always people that I think are very capable. I do not like hiring people just to execute. Sometimes people say, I'll hire someone very junior so they can just execute. If I'm hiring a person like that, they need to show me a potential of being able to be my right hand in 2, 3, 4 years, whatever that time period is. And then lastly, agency. I think agency plays a big role. I mean, we work with agencies over the last couple of years. We are working with agency now. We haven't taken everything fully in-house, and we'll see how it's going to be. I don't know. I don't want to speak about long-term strategy, but a lot of companies in those stages like B, C, and once you may be a public and you mature and you've been around for like 5, 6, 7 years, you might build your own internal team. But a lot of companies at that stage, and a lot of really famous companies, that are still working with agencies, and they're still employing outside source. And the reason is agencies employ a really good agency, employ very, very, very experienced media buyers. It's really hard, especially now in this environment, in this market, to secure this amount of experienced media buyers. Having 5 people with 8 years of experience will take you forever to hire in this market. Those people are in demand. So bringing an agency is important. What you need to make sure is that if you're a senior marketing manager, head of UA, VP of growth, whatever your position is, if you are the person whose job is depending on the performance of this agency, such as mine, right? If you're in this position, what you want to make sure is that whoever agency gives you are the people that you work together for a certain period of time, and you have your own, probation period, for the lack of the better word, right? You don't want to have your junior media buyers overseeing an agency. You want to be involved yourself to make sure that the people that you're hiring are top level from the agency side, and then you trust them to run things for you. You'll have them build the reporting, you have them build all the cadence of speaking to you, right? Like you want to be involved at least in the early stages, because what I've seen before in other companies is when a person that is not necessarily qualified is overseeing the relationship. That's extremely important. So if you are the person whose job depends on the success of this particular agency, you should be involved yourself, and you should make sure in the first couple of months when you're ramping up that the people they brought on board are as good as agencies always self-promote and sells themselves to be, right? So that's really, really important.
Right, and it's certainly something I've seen, just because I think the agency client dynamic is particularly sensitive. I think one phenomenon I've seen play out in the industry is that the person pitching is generally experienced and the person executing is junior. That's one pitfall. The other one you touched on as well, which is the VP or the CEO hires the agency on the client side and then basically steps out of the relationship, and the junior person is overseeing the agency. I think both those can be somewhat common pitfalls, and I think that definitely makes sense to avoid. I'm also just curious, you talked about this from a UA perspective. Does the same line of reasoning apply for creative production as well, vis-a-vis full-time versus contractor versus agency?
It really depends on how labor extensive your creative processes and what are some of the goals and needs that you have, right? Because creative can be a bit different. Your creative team can be catering to multiple stakeholders, right? It's not just UA. Your creative could be working with brand. Your creative could be producing something for your company's product content. So from UA perspective, I would say similarly, right? Like you need to have maybe a couple of core people in-house, but then you can outsource from making sure that like you have enough assets delivered. Sometimes in-house team cannot really produce this much. Oftentimes you need to outsource, but you need to do quality checks in-house, and you need to have people in-house that are putting things together and are kind of like a middleman between the agencies and yourself. So I don't have a set game plan for that, a playbook for that. But I would say that definitely the core needs to be in-house. You'll need to have a couple of people that are controlling for the quality, and that could also relay the brand messaging, right? Relay what works, what doesn't. You need people that know and understand the product well as well in order to go to agencies and outsource and give them the expectations of what the creative work needs to be, right? So that's kind of the key component here. But sometimes you need to do so much. Sometimes your company is so involved in your creative department, right? Because you know that companies like, let's say a good example is Airbnb, a company with a very strong visual appeal, a very strong visual messaging, right? I've personally worked with someone who was a CMO at Airbnb, and they told me that 99% of the work was really outsourced in the early stages because they had so much work that was being done on brand, on performance, and a few other things. And so it just really depends on your company, but the controls and the quality control should really be in-house and stay with you.
Yeah, from what you're saying, even if the execution is done externally, the quality control has to happen internally, right? I think that's a useful distinction, right? Yeah. And I'm curious, how is the team structured just now between functions, if you will?
So, I mean, and there's a dedicated creative team, right? People that work on creative, there's producers, there's content people. So we have like a clear separation, and this marketing team where you have product marketing with CRM, with all the internal initiatives where we're trying to convert people and drive monetization. And then on the UI side, specifically for my team, I have an ASO person. I have a person that manages the agency relationship. I have an agency which has 5 or 6 media buyers. Then I also have my MarTech person. And lastly, I have a right-hand, so to speak, a UA manager that does all the ad hoc requests, that builds a lot of executive decks for me, and that just really looks into optimization and drives better efficiency through really being freed up from day to day. I think that's very important. I think that's one thing that I also would want to really kind of emphasize, is that you need to have someone on your team that pulls up from day to day, that is not involved into like launching creatives or overseeing any kind of relationship. I myself, when I was in the position, of reporting to someone on the UA team, and I was kind of an individual contributor, one thing about it was that I always felt that my time was better spent looking at things where I had creative freedom to do something, right? Like I had that free time to pitch in. And so I'm trying to adhere to that kind of policy in my company. I have one guy that does a lot of reporting, that does a lot of ad hoc stuff, but that person has 50 to 60% of their time where they can focus on finding gaps in some of how we do things, finding efficiencies. And that's very important, and has been driving a lot of our progress. And I try to do that for myself too, as much as I can. Given I run a pretty big team, I try to have some free time so I can think about things and not just run around and execute. That's really kind of the lay of the land and the setup for the team.
Yeah, you have to build slack in the system.
Yeah.
This is a bit of a U-turn, if you will. So I remember you writing on LinkedIn, and this is something I'm paraphrasing, but you said attribution is fine. It gives you a somewhat incomplete picture of what's happening with your marketing. But if you really want a complete view of what's going on, you really need to understand incrementality. So how does that play out in your day-to-day processes? I know you talked about how you're measuring scan and performance by making some estimations. What are some of the methodologies that you use? What are some of the tools that you use to understand incrementality?
I think you got the general idea right. You were paraphrasing pretty accurate. I think it's kind of one of the biggest challenges in the space is that, well, A, it's not really easy to measure incrementality. B, a lot of people don't really think about it this way. So it's really a question of your fundamental thinking about what the efficiency means to you at the marketing level. Like, why is incrementality that important versus just have an attribution, right? And B, how do you go about measuring this? So to answer part one, I would say that, why is incrementality even important? Like, what's the big deal? Like, why can't we just run our campaigns the way we are, get regular attribution, and don't worry about incrementality? Well, people come with different intent. People come to your ads and people come to your channels with different intent. For example, one channel that has a very interesting relationship with attribution versus incrementality is Apple Search. So when someone lands on your Apple search page, right, and they search for Dave, right, our company, or they search for Zing, or they search for Lyft or Uber or Airbnb or anything, right, to that regard, any consumer app, the person comes with a very, very high intent. And so what does Apple search do? Like, how does that work? How does the mechanics work? Apple search will then serve your own ad on top of your ad being shown in Apple search. So in essence, a person that already is looking for your consumer app is going to have an ad. And if they click on that ad, they're going to convert based on something that they had a super high intent to begin with. What are the chances that if they never saw that ad and they're already looking for the product, they would convert? I think to me, the chances are very, very high, right? So what is the real incrementality of that? As opposed to someone who've never heard about your product, who's just coming in cold, seen an ad and then converting. So that's a really good example. Why do we do that on Apple? Like, why do people even run ads? Well, the reason why, there's always logic behind it, is that if you don't bid on your own space, someone else can bid on your terms. And then, for example, one of your main competitors can be shown above you, and someone who was looking for you is now downloading your competitor's ad. So interesting dilemma, right? Like, those people would probably download your app, but if a competitor app would show up when they search for you, who knows? Maybe they will download your competitor instead, because it's right one row above you. But on the incrementality front, right? Like, you need to understand each channel's incrementality. You need to start breaking it down into elements. First, you look at your portfolio. What can you do? What are some of the strategies? My first strategy, and I think it's kind of funny, but I think it's the least scientific of them all, but it's the most accurate and it's the most brutish in a way. Start turning your paid acquisition off and see what happens. That is a very, very baseline strategy. And then start adding one channel at a time and see what happens to your overall mix.
Sure.
So you have a dashboard where it tells you, today we had 5,000 installs. You turn off all your paid acquisition, you end up with 3,000 installs, right? That's one thing. So you can do it this way. Second thing is leverage the capabilities of the UIs. Unfortunately, that becomes more and more limited. Facebook used to be able to run an incrementality test, not so much with iOS 14. You can still do it on the Android and it's fairly accurate, but iOS is no longer there. So maybe you can use Android results as a proxy for iOS. I would say a lot of times it's fairly accurate. Google has an incrementality tool too. You can actually run an incrementality test on Google. You can do it on Snapchat. Snapchat does not have it in the UI. However, you could set it up with your reps and they can actually like set it up in a way where they can do it. TikTok is getting very close to that point too. So you can leverage your partnerships in order to measure incrementality. On the portfolio level, I would say the best way is still turning on and turning off your incrementality. On the channel level, you have levers. The other lever is what is called match market. And that's a fairly interesting idea. Is you take one market, such as, I don't know, Columbus, Ohio, right? And you flood the market with ad spend for the specific channels. You have your baseline before. In Columbus, Ohio, we were getting 200 installs. What happens when we spend more money? Now, that approach a lot of times works for non-direct response campaigns. So things like billboards, things like radio, right? Because it's really hard to isolate for geo-specific campaigns on big platforms such as Facebook and Google and get efficient results. What will happen is you will do a match market test. You will select one region on Facebook and your costs will skyrocket as compared to your national campaigns, because Facebook just doesn't have enough signal to optimize efficiently for people that are just in Columbus, Ohio. So there's a flaw to this type of system. This system only works for non-DR or direct response ads, so non-digital ads for the most part. So yeah, there's different strategies to mitigate and different strategies to measure. But I think a good old very baseline approach is probably the best, especially if you're in your early stage of your company and you can afford to turn on and turn off certain channels. If you're a publicly traded company and you want to measure incrementality through turning off all of your paid acquisition, there is a cost to be paid there, cost and efficiencies. When you turn this back on your campaigns, you lose all the history, right? So they have to re-optimize again. You can lose some money there. You'll need to ramp up. You don't know how platforms will behave. But if you're in early stages and if you can afford that strategy and you add a new channel, you turn it on, turn it off, see what happens with your overall mix. I mean, that's the incrementality in a nutshell. What happens when I turn off one channel? Do I actually get more overall conversions from that? Like that is the definition of incrementality.
Yeah. And from what you're saying, it oftentimes isn't always necessary to use elaborate statistical techniques, right? Of course, if you have the resources, you could do that.
Yeah.
Simon, this has been incredibly instructive, and I know we've gone longer than we had originally planned. So I want to be respectful of your schedule. Thank you so much for sharing all of your insights with us. I've certainly taken notes, and I think this is going to be incredibly instructive for everybody. But before we let you carry on, could you tell folks how they can find out more about you and everything you do?
Yeah, sure. And thanks again. Thanks for having me, Shaman. It's a pleasure, man, and a pleasure to reconnect and have this conversation and really thoughtful questions. I appreciate us getting in depth. You can find me through my LinkedIn, obviously, at Simon Vishnevskiy. You can also look me up through my current company, Dave. I'm a head of UA at Dave, so you can find me on LinkedIn. And then also, as a bit of a last piece of self-promotion, I actually do help startups and a few other companies, and I have my own consulting services that I can provide. And that's also through my LinkedIn. I've worked with some very reputable companies in the past. And anytime, if anyone wants to ping me on anything growth related, LinkedIn is the way to go. And I'm happy to answer the questions and consult, because again, it's a very dynamic space. Things change a lot. And I am very, very thankful to have great mentors and people that I can go to. And I just want to pay it forward and have this type of an impact on the space. And this was really, really great in that regard. Hopefully there's people that take something from it. And if there's people that can teach me and correct me, I'm also open to listening and having this type of communication and feedback.
Wonderful. And you're certainly paying it forward. So thank you for sharing. We will link to everything in the show notes. Thank you so much, Simon, for being in the show.
Thank you.
For more tips, pointers, and strategies from the leading edge of mobile user acquisition, subscribe to our YouTube channel right here, or check out our blog, rocketship.hq.com/blog.